Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me warmly welcome you all, those present here and others viewing on the YouTube link, to the 158th lecture of the National Trust, which will be delivered this evening on the topic Temple Paintings of Sri Lanka during the Colonial period by Professor Chandanie Wanigatunge. I am Tanki Vikramaratne, Honorary President, that is what we call all our past presidents, and at the end of the lecture, our President Ismat Rahim, Architect Ismat Rahim, will handle the Q&A. Before we proceed to the lecture, I request your indulgence to spend a few moments to reflect on the life and work of Professor Sudarshan Senviratne, who passed away recently. I have known Sudarshan since childhood. He went to Ananda College and excelled as a student and a sportsman and became the college's head prefect, a rare distinction. He went on for his undergraduate study at the Delhi University and thereafter for his master's and doctoral degrees in archaeology at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, that reputed University of India, under the mentorship of the renowned Professor Romila Thapar. On returning to Sri Lanka in 1979, he joined the Department of Archaeology at the University of Ceylon, Peradeniya, my old university, and went on to become the Professor of Archaeology. He was involved in the 1980s onwards as a young archaeologist in the groundbreaking and exciting excavations at Polonnaruwa and Kandy under the auspices of the UNESCO-funded Central Cultural Fund. He was archaeological director of the conservation of the Jetavana Stupa in Anuradhapura and was associated with Dr. Siran Deraniyagala and Professor Senaka Bandanayaka, eminent archaeologists in excavations at Anuradhapura and in particular the Citadel project. He went on to be the president of the Central Cultural Fund in the period 2007 to 10, following the tradition of archaeologists and conservationists of the National Trust who went on similar illustrious pathways. He provided leadership during this time for the setting up of museums at Sigiriya, Katharagama, and the Maritime Archaeology Museum in Galle. He has been active in the founding of various institutions, including the Postgraduate Institute of Archaeology, which is the home of the National Trust. I will not go into a long elaboration of his many achievements, except to say that he completed his service to the country, being its ambassador to India as High Commissioner in New Delhi, and after that in Dhaka as High Commissioner for Bangladesh and the Kingdom of Bhutan. He has been closely associated with the Trust, having given 2 lectures, one at the very inception, perhaps in 2009, I think, and the other in 2016, with a lecture titled Memories of Stone, and I invite you all to visit the National Trust website and listen to that lecture. We have had his support thereafter too, when at his invitation, Professor Romila Thapar, his guru, honored the National Trust with a lecture from New Delhi on the occasion of the second Dr. Roland Silva Memorial Lecture, that was in 2022. His was truly a great life, spent in the service of his country, his chosen field of archaeology, his students and colleagues, with a unique mix of high intellect, great humility and charm. It was Sudarshan a few months ago who asked me if I might speak to a young lady who had done some interesting work on temple art and whether the trust would be interested in speaking to her. I got in touch with Chandanie, not knowing anything of her background, and I spoke to her briefly. I am somewhat discomfited that I may have been too casual in that conversation. It was only on receiving an email I became aware that the girl he had referred to was a senior professor of pharmacology of the University of Sri Jayawardenepura. I listened to her talk to the medical fraternity on the subject of her interest and thought it was astonishingly good and invited her to speak to us as soon as possible and in November. But it was not to be, yet it is happening today even though Sudarshan is not present. May I please request you, before Chandanie goes on to speak, to please switch off your mobile phone so it does not disturb the lecture in the auditorium or its live transmission. I wish that you enjoy the lecture as much as I did and a very fine evening thereafter. I would now take a few minutes to introduce our learned speaker. Professor Chandanie Wanigatunge is a physician by training. She is the senior professor and chair of pharmacology of the Faculty of Medical Sciences, University of Sri Jayawardenepura, and the deputy director of the Postgraduate Institute of Medicine, University of Colombo. Her research interests are in rational prescribing and medicines used in older adults. Chandanie enjoys reading, wildlife, history, and photography. Her hobbies and passions have led her to study archaeology and temple paintings, and she has delivered talks on varying topics based on her interests. Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Chandanie to address this audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for that very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm both humbled and honored to be here this evening, considering the fact that I'm not an expert on the topic that I'm going to talk to you today. I'm deeply honored by this invitation, and I'd like to thank the National Trust for this singular honor, and I hope at the end of it, I would have done justice to the introduction given by Professor Sudarshan Seneviratne of me to the Trust. So ladies and gentlemen, my interest in temple paintings during Colonial period spans for nearly 1.5 decades. And when I first started looking at these pictures, I had a few questions to answer. Why did they paint, particularly in temples during this period? What did they paint? And what were the stories they selected and why did they do that? What styles did they follow? And were they trying to give a message to the people in any way? And if so, what was it? And that is what led me to study these areas over the last decade. So for the ease of presentation, I've actually divided into various periods, which is the standard things that are being done in many of the textbooks that come with this. But you will realize that these are not very rigid periods, and therefore they keep changing from one to the other. So the period that I will cover will be from the 18th century, mid-18th century to the mid-20th century, which is technically the colonial period. We first met the colonials, the Portuguese, in 1505. They came to a divided land, and therefore they could easily get a foothold into this. Their main aim was to promote the Roman Catholic religion to the non-believers, and they left no stones unturned in trying to achieve their objective. They razed some of the temples to the ground, vandalized others, and built churches sometimes over where the temples were. When King Rajasingha I ascended the throne in Sitavaka, these problems became worse because he had an issue with the Buddhist monks who did not expiate him from the sin of patricide. And therefore, he also attacked Buddhism. He also attacked Buddhist temples, and he also disrobed some of the Buddhist monks. And therefore, they had to flee to the Kandyan kingdom. So with that, with the Portuguese on the one hand, and King Rajasingha on the other, the Sinhala Buddhist aspects of our culture and the country shifted to Kandy. The Dutch were no better. Of course, they were a lot more subtle, and they used Christianity as a bait for people to get into the government service. Now, with all these problems, many monks were not really what the monks of the past were. And there was a period in the country where we did not have monks who had the higher ordination or the upasampada in sufficient numbers. These people were occupying temples, not exactly the temples as we know today, or what was known in the past. They were more like lay people because there were a lot of problems and they were not getting the state patronage. They were doing various other businesses and other livelihood activities so that they could live their usual life. Some of them had their own families living either in the temple or in a house nearby, which was known as the Gane Gedara. The temples were known as Gane Vihares. And these people were known traditionally as Ganinanses. Now, interestingly, this bit of the history I found depicted very clearly in a temple in Thailand. Now, this temple, the Wat Dharmarama, is where Thero Mahaupali came to Sri Lanka, bringing the higher ordination on the invitation of King Kirtisri Rajasingha. Now, it is in this background that King Kirtisri Rajasingha ascended the throne in Kandy. Now, he is a Nayakar king, and therefore took an extra interest in Buddhism just so that he could show the people, look, I'm one of you. He was ably supported by Valavita Saranankara Thero, who was also a monk, but not in the category of Ganinanses because he belonged to the group which was known as the Silvat group, who tried to follow the doctrine and the teachings of the Buddha as it was known. Now, one of the things that Rajasingha had to do at that time was to get the people back to the temples, to spread the message of the Buddha to the people. Now, these were people who had very little access to the temple simply because of the socio-political situation at that point of time. And one method that he used was to use paintings to give a visual message to the people. And it is said that he left no vihara of any importance in the Kandy district which was not restored by him or newly built. Now, that is how the Kandyan paintings as we know seems to have started. Now, it is described as the Kandyan school of paintings because it is centrifugal with Kandy as the center, spreading from that area to the rest of the country. Some people believe that they were influenced by the South Indian paintings at that time. Others believe that there was some influence from Siam, because that is where we got some of these monks to come, and we had very close ties with Thailand or Siam at that point. Yet others believe that it is not totally an outside thing. It was something that we had from the Anuradhapura Polonnaruwa period, which continued in different forms, and over which Kirtisri and his painters went in and drew their paintings. Now, there is evidence to suggest that that is possibly the case, because if it was something totally new, it is unlikely that the people would accept it so readily, because it became so widespread and widely accepted. Now, there is evidence of overpainting. If you look at that picture in Degaldarua, where the cursor is the traditional Kandyan paintings, and I'll describe that in a moment. But underneath that, when those paintings peeled off, you can also see a different type of a painting. It is probably a person wearing the traditional Kandyan dress, because you can see the 7 chains, the last one coming fairly lower down. And in his hand, here, you see a handkerchief. Now, if you look at the styles, they are totally different. So, the theory that there was overpainting on what was already there is plausible. So, when you look at these Kandyan paintings or Kandyan school of paintings, there are certain characteristic features. Firstly, they would divide the wall or the surface into strips, horizontal strips, and whatever they drew would be drawn within those strips. They used simple continuous narration where you could read from the left to the right as a story. The events would be depicted like that. They would generally use white or yellow lines to separate the panels and writing beneath them to explain the picture. Colors were mainly yellow, red and white and black, And they used natural pigments, whatever they could find from the environment, to make these paint. Lines played a very predominant role, and each of these pictures, whatever they drew, were outlined, mostly in red, sometimes with black to give a relief effect. Most interestingly, they drew the figures either as a front view or as a side view, but in every instance, the feet were drawn to the side. They didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about the proportions of the pictures. You will see that in most of the ones that I'm going to share, but they just concentrated on giving a few messages. Now, when you look at these Kandyan school of paintings, there are few themes that run across. One is that the previous Buddhas, the 28 Buddhas of the previous, in the past. Then, of course, they also drew the 16 places of worship in the country, the ones which are said to have been visited by the Buddha at some time or the other. Now, in these Kandyan paintings, there are two things that one must understand. One is that three things rather. You will see the usual style of the Kandyan paintings. You will also see certain regional variations, and you will also see certain individual variations based on the painter. So they had these 16 places of worship. They also had the 7 weeks after enlightenment, usually starting with the Mara Paraja and ending with the first sermon. And of course, the Suvisi Vivarana, the declaration of the 24 former Buddhas, approving the Bodhisattva as the future Gautama Buddha. Now, with time, originally there would have been just a few words explaining what it is, but with time, these were replaced with prose or verse, which would explain not only who the Buddha was and not only who the Bodhisattva was, but what he exactly did, so that these Buddhas proclaimed him as the future Buddha. Now, in addition to these, in few temples, you can also see certain selected life events of the Buddha's life drawn as pictures. As you can see, there is the Kiripindu Dana on top there, and then the Great Renunciation. So that is seen not in all, although the earlier ones are seen practically in all the temples, the events from the life of Buddha are seen only in few selected temples. Mind you, these image houses are small, they have very limited space, so probably they selected the topics just so that they can give a very simple message to the people while attracting them back to the temples. They also selected certain Jataka stories to illustrate key aspects of the life of the Buddha. There again, you see the continuous narration style and the red outline. And as I told you earlier, the proportions of the animals to the humans was not really thought of. The elephant is practically almost only slightly taller than the human beings. And that's not the norm. So they selected these Jataka stories mainly to illustrate the benefits of giving, of generosity. The reasons were twofold. One is, of course, to inculcate good habits in people. The second is, of course, to ensure that there's continuity in the order of monks and the temple, because that was a problem they had, because they were not getting alms from the people, and that is why they had to deviate and go for other various livelihoods. So they selected these Jataka stories. In certain instances, they would mainly select the key incidents in these Jataka stories, so that when you look at it, you know what the story is. So the top obviously is the Vesantara Jataka, and the other one is the Uraga Jataka. And Uraga Jataka, incidentally, is not seen in many of the other temples. Vesantara Jataka is very commonly seen. Not only did they tell stories, for us living today, they give us an idea of the lifestyles during that period, specifically the social hierarchy and its order. The place of a woman in the society, as you can see, it is always seconded to the man. In both these, you can see the woman taking a back seat, not the front. It also shows a certain cultural habits For example, it tells us that it was okay for the noble women to be bare-breasted inside their house, even in front of a stranger. But when they go out of the house, you need to cover the top if you are a noble woman. But it's not the case if you are a serving woman. And it's interesting to see that the serving woman has been drawn in a darker skin color than the noble women of the house. They would also give us an idea of the clothes that people wore at that time. The detail showing exactly how the social hierarchy changed with clothes. They used whatever that was available to them to tell the story. And this is taken from the Mara Paraja in Begaldarua, where the Mara's army, which is very fierce looking with all sorts of animals around them, have been given guns. And when you look at these guns, they have been drawn in very minute details. You can see everything very clearly. So why the guns to the Mara's army? Because Mara's army definitely would not have had guns, even if it was a physical army. So for them, probably the gun was the most fearsome weapon that anybody could have. And therefore, why not give it to the Mara's army to attack the Buddha? They also drew a lot of details in tiny spaces. This is just this particular part that I have enlarged, just to show how they have drawn the details of the headdress within that tiny frame. Although they were now very particular about the most of the human figures, they did take extra care when they drew the figure of the Buddha. So it was drawn in exact proportions, and we have evidence to show that there were guidelines and various calculations done to show so that they got the exact proportion of that picture. Now, when you look at the country at that point, the map shows the area in which the kingdom of Kandy extended to, and of course the coastal area, which was initially under the Portuguese and subsequently under the Dutch. So we see these types of paintings spreading right along to these regions. We see them in Dambulla. We see them in a place called Budugehinna, which is in Galewela, at the border of Dambulla and Anuradhapura. Typical Kandyan style, the red background, clear figures, flowers floating in empty spaces, very simple outline, the legs turned to a side. I selected this picture because this is one of the few that I have seen, where the Mara's army is depicted with human figures. Usually you get various fierce-looking animals. And this is one of the few where they had human figures, but of course with various animals around their body. Now we can see regional variations, individual variations, because both Dambulla and Budugehinna are fairly close to each other in the same region. Dambulla ones are very extensive and very intrinsic in their drawings, whereas the Budugehinna ones are equally pretty and beautiful, but less, when you look at them, they are very less intricate in their drawings of the gods. We see the same pictures, the same style in places like Dambadeniya. The top one has probably been retouched, but the bottom one probably is what was there originally. Places far down as Mulkirigala, which was at the border of the Kandyan kingdom and the maritime provinces. Mulkirigala, the early 19th century pictures, the top one is among the earlier ones, and the second one is more like the ones that you see in the traditional Kandyan style, but they changed within the province when they went to that area with what the people in that region saw. We see the red outline, but we also see that the interior of the buildings are colored in black. And the trees become less stylistic, they look more realistic in other words, and we also see some influence of what these people have seen in their attires. So the Western attires have now come into the pictures in the southern region. Same style is seen in the Yudaganava Rajamahavihara. It looks very much more basic than the ones that we saw from the Kandyan period, probably from an earlier era, where the Ganinanses or the monks used other styles and other ways of getting people to come back to the temples. In far outskirts in Kotiagala, that is in off Monaragala, So that is the first time I actually saw the Muchalin, the Nagadharana, with 6 other cobras on either side. And the predominant color there was blue in all the pictures in Kottayagala, in the Vattegama Purana Vihara. And interestingly, even in temples which were outside the Kandyan king's control, like the old temple image house in the Colonial Raja Mahavihara. Here in the inner part of the image house, you can see the traditional Kandyan style drawings, whereas the lower part, in the outer part of the image house, you see more of a southern style where the dressers, the instruments and so on are more from the southern period. In addition to the Jataka stories and the lives of the Buddha, these image houses were also decorated with pictures or images of arhats. And the arhats are identified by the clouds on which they are, and they usually carry a flower, and in the Kandyan region, they were either kadupul or lotus or jasmine and flowers like that. This was the time where we had incorporated a lot of Hindu beliefs, and the deities were part of our lives. And within these image houses, on their walls, you would also see pictures of various deities. So Skanda drawn in a very basic way. Interesting to see that the six heads are on his shoulder, and they have got the shoulder very broad. Ganesh with 3 eyes. And we saw the 3-eyed Ganesh again at the Kalani Raja Mahavihara. They also had pictures of their benefactors. The one in the corner apparently is King Srivikrama Rajasingha, according to the head monk or the head priest of the temple. But more than that, they also drew the people who supported to build the temples and made donations for it. And the wealth and the prestige was shown by the size of the portrait and the costumes and the accessories they wore. In addition to that, the empty spaces were covered with various creepers and other images which are characteristic of the Kandyan period. And with time, some of the places were decorated with pictures of the Maitri Bodhisattva or the Mahabrahma. But out of all the Kandyan period paintings that I have seen, this is the one that fascinated me the most. The legend says, Volgalle Sumangala Unvahanse, Vattegama Sumana Unvahanse, and Muppane Piyadasi Unvahanse, suggesting that these are actually the Ganinanses who were there, because Unnanse is the term that they used when they addressed the Ganinanses. It's not only the names, but when you look at the dress, the red band that they wore around their waists as well as on the shoulders, and the fact that they grew their beards and had long hair probably shows that these are Ganinanses. And this is probably one of the few pictorial evidence that we have of that period in our history. So in 1798, the British came to Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, and in 1815, we ceded the country to them, and Lanka became a part of the British Empire. Whatever that the lip service they played to give Buddhism its due place vanished with the Uva rebellion, and they had a very significant clamping on the activities of the Buddhist monks. They took away some of the land grants given by the king. They also made sure that people were not encouraged, rather they were persecuted if they went to the temples, and therefore the Kandyan kingdom had a problem in sustaining these temples. When the nobles and the king's patronage was removed, the Buddhist temples fell into despair, as did the art of Kandyan. However, situation was different in the maritime provinces. There we now had a generation of people who have been educated under the missionary schools, who were nominal Christians, but were really Buddhist, who wanted to do something else so that the Buddhism could thrive in the maritime regions. And with that, we see these paintings of the maritime region coming into play. Now, there are certain similarities from the Kandyan period. As you can see, the red background, the outline that you see, but of course, and the side views and the front views of the people, but there are many changes that took place where it showed the lifestyle of the people in these maritime regions. Interestingly, these temples were much bigger. They had image houses which had the central image house. Unlike the Kandyan period where you had only one image house, they had this central image house around which there was an ambulatory passage which was also walled and roofed, giving these artists enough space to draw. Now, the central image house had the main Buddha statue, sometimes reclining, sometimes seated, or even standing. And the paintings were very simple. They usually had the arhats with flowers worshipping the Buddha, and occasionally would have the people again going to worship the Buddha, reminiscence of the Gandhakuti, or the fragrance chambers when the Buddha was alive. When these people came out after worshipping the Buddha, they walked into these ambulatory passages. And the walls were decorated with pictures. And you would go around, most of the time, you would do about 3 circuits, which means that you would go around the main image house 3 times, which is the usual that we do as a normal practice. Here too, we see the horizontal lines, horizontal panels being used, separated by white lines or yellow lines. Again, the same style, black background coming to show the interior of the house. And in addition to the life of the Buddha, we see stories of the Mahavansa also coming into the drawings or paintings in these temples. In contrast to the Kandyan period, these drawings or these paintings sometimes were extremely crowded. As you can see in the middle panel, it's very difficult to identify the story unless you know what the story is. Of course, they would write a small legend or a detailed legend detailing what it is. Now, they also had the Suvisi Vivarana, just like in the Kandyan period. They had the 7 weeks after the Enlightenment. They also had the Jataka stories like Vesanta. So what was different? Now, as you can see, the bottom panel is the typical events of the Vesantara story that all of us see and we can identify with. The top panel is actually baby Vesantara inside his mom in the cornermost one, as a little baby and growing up and practicing dana. So they added various things to tell the story. They had the 16 places of worship, and there were additions to that, like the Sri Darada Maligawa, which is drawn here. Interesting to see what they have drawn. It depicts the Tevava that you would see even up to date. But in addition to that, you can see a European-looking god at the bottom. And the fillers that we see with the southern style paintings, like the bird, the squirrel, and the flowers. And the flowers are not the traditional Kandyan flowers that you saw, the floating ones, the lotuses and so on, but more like roses and others that were seen in the southern region. They would go into details. If you look at the Maraparaja is traditionally drawn like what you would see in the old image house in the Kalani Rajamaha Vihara. You have the Buddha seated in the middle. You would either see, you'll see Mara coming from one side with all his army, and on the other side you see the Mara being vanquished, falling down, and his army going backwards. But in the southern drawings, they got more details. And the one that fascinated me was this one, where the Mara was talking to the Buddha with his finger pointed like this. And I went back to read what it was. And that is where actually when the Mara asked the Buddha after being vanquished, what gives you the right to sit on that Vajrasana? What have you done more than me? And that gives you the right. And who is your witness to what you have done? And then the Buddha replies, I have done so many things. I have given so many danas, the 5 most important ones as Vesantara and in the other birds. I do not have any live beings as my witness, but the earth is my witness. And that is where we see the Mahikanta saying, yes, I stand witness to that he is the right person to sit on that Vajrasana. I found it fascinating because in most of the other paintings, they would drop that part, and particularly with this finger saying, what gives you the right? Which is what a normal gesture that people would use. Comparing the two, you look at the drawings from the Kandyan period, they are very simple. And they just give the story very briefly. That's the 5th week after enlightenment, taken from Uddavihare and Vidya Vihare. The dresses are very classically Kandyan, just the Buddha seated, and the three Mara's daughters dancing, playing, trying to entice him. The lower panel is from the Samudragiri Vihara in Mirissa. There are some additional things. And when you go into the Buddhist literature, what it says is during the 5th week, the Mara's daughters found the Mara wondering what has happened to him. He was very sad, and then they went and asked him, why are you sad? And that is what is being depicted there. So the details, the minute details, were added in during the southern period drawings. In addition to that, of course, the dressers give us an idea of what the people in the region wore at that time. The life of the Buddha was drawn in detail, starting from the invitation by the Devas to come to this world as the Buddha, until the Buddha Parinirvana and the relics being divided. Every step of the way was drawn in the southern temples. Sometimes there were new additions which were not seen in the Kandyan school, like the rainy seasons spent and how the Buddha spent the different rainy seasons. The Jataka stories, in addition to Vesantara and the traditional ones, now we see a lot of Mahoshada, Umag Jataka and the Mahoshada Panditya stories coming in graphic details. If you look at the legend there, it says, Rahaski kevattage kate paharagos. Panditumata epavat ki hatiya menna. And if you look at the image, you will see the parrot eavesdropping, and then he is putting his excrement into the Kevatya's mouth and going and telling the Mahoshada Panditya what has happened. Incidentally, they have drawn an Alexandrine parakeet, not a common rose-ringed parakeet that we see day to day. It's very fascinating as to why they decided to draw the Alexandrine parakeet. They had other stories coming. Now, this was a time where people were doing a lot of vices, which according to Buddhist teaching was not acceptable. And they selected stories to illustrate them. Like the story of Soraya Sitano, which says that even if you have a bad thought, the effect can be seen later. Stories like Telapatta Jataka, where they tell you if you indulge in your senses too much, without being cautious and wise, that could be detrimental. So they selected stories to say certain, to pass certain messages to the people, especially considering the lifestyles that they had at that time. In addition to those, there were also stories from various bhikkhus and theras during the time of the Buddha, like the story of Patachara. That again in minute details. Okay, I'd like to draw your attention to this tree here, which actually has nothing to do with the story. There is a man trying to climb a talipot tree, and it is drawn in very minute details. You can see the coconut husks, which are used as steps for him to climb. That has nothing to do with this story. And these odd fillers are seen in these southern paintings, like here. This is one of the Satara Paranimiti, where Siddhartha sees an old man, and you see that filler, a man plucking king coconuts, drawn in perfect detail. As to why they drew that, it's very difficult to answer. Looking at the images, you can see a heavy Western influence and the disproportionate charioteer in contrast to the people inside the carriage. Now, interestingly, when there was redrawing in the Kandyan region temples, you again see these fillers. This is from Dambulla, and you can see in the corner a tree with a monkey on top. So the concepts traveled right around the country. There were no boundaries. When you compare with the Kandyan drawings, the arhats now carried different flowers. They had Western-looking pots and vases as decorative elements, and the fillers. The trees were more realistic. Of course, the proportions were again still not quite right, but the trees are very realistic. You can easily identify the cashew tree. The leaves are just what you would see normally, the mango tree and so on. And in the corner one, you can even see a purple-headed monkey, the endemic to this region in the southern part. Now, when it came to the southern period, people were also into a lot of occult things and various gods and various devils and so on. Okay. So you see these devils coming into the picture in their paintings, like the Shiva Bhairava to scare away evil influences. And of course, the traditional roof paintings where you had flowers are now being replaced in some parts with the zodiac signs. In many instances, they were really not worried about the accuracy. Now, this is the first sermon, and we know very clearly this is not the deer park. This is not a forest. They didn't matter to them. It's all what mattered to the artist in many instances was that they just drew the story so that the story was understood by the people when they read it and followed it through. But in some instances, especially when the story is from the Mahavansa, they were very, very accurate. I was actually wondering what this deity was doing holding a tree behind the Buddha, and found the answer in the Mahavansa, which says that the Deva named Samidda Sumana took a Rajayatana tree standing in Jetavana, his own fair habitation, and holding it like a parasol over the conqueror, attended him to the spot where he had formerly dwelt. And the artist had drawn it perfectly. So you see a contrast where sometimes they are not really worried about the context, but in other instances where they draw it exactly according to what has been written. Interesting to see that they sometimes put these foreign-looking figures into a story. This is King Suddhodana giving instructions to build 3 palaces to Prince Siddhartha. And apparently that's Vishwakarma, the architect, who did it. As to why he drew the architect in Western clothing is very, very puzzling. Whether they have seen an architect or an engineer in Western clothes and put him there is not known. But he is there, and it's a full suit, complete with that watch shop. In certain instances, the entire picture would be Western, as in this, which is the story of Mahadana Sitana. And interestingly, at the very corner there, on the right, at that right-hand corner, you see a lady going up the stairs. In the Kandyan paintings, usually you will not see a rear view. I'm just trying to see whether I can show you here, because I've been told not to touch this as the connection is loose, but the one there, where you can see her climbing up, and that's a rear view that you see. When they drew the story, they took from what they knew, and that is how the king distributed or administered his justice or his punishments. Sometimes they used what they saw in their own day-to-day lives. This is a traditional kitchen. You can see the coconut scraper and the people using the pots the normal way when they cook the rice. In certain instances, you would see an entire Western household coming into this Buddhist story. You can see the spittoons and you can see the separate pairs of slippers nicely kept on a side. The 2 of them in their own tables doing what they wanted. They sometimes gave an idea of the clothes that people wore. This was a little bit later. You can see the tweed coat and the sarong, the thick coat and the material, even that is very visible in the paintings. The horseshoe-shaped bent comb or the namipana that the people used at that time. I was quite curious to know actually whether they wore this when they went to the Perahara, particularly when they were doing the Panteru and the Rabang dances, dressed like that. But more interestingly, in the corner, you see the papare band that we see today in the Perahara going with the others. It's fascinating to see what they brought in just so that they could illustrate a story. Of course, people had to be reminded that there was a hell so that they would not go to do various things which might take them to hell. Now, they didn't just draw the hells, but they also drew very graphically what you shouldn't do, and if you do those things, what would happen to you. Interestingly, they also showed us that if you do certain good things, you will be rewarded in your next birth. And in most instances, what they were again advocating were the danas to various people meditating, doing good, and that you will be rewarded in the next birth. Heavens came into the picture as well. little bit later. And interestingly, when you look at the heavens, most of the time the main deity would be enjoying himself with the female deities. And the male figures are drawn as guards or attendants to help them out. So heaven for them was a place where all your needs would be fulfilled by a woman. Unless, of course, you ended up in the Brahma Loka where there were only men. In many instances, there was no way to identify who painted what. Now, this is a very tiny panel in the Karaganpitiya Subodharamaya, but if you enlarge that picture, it's a very tiny one, if you enlarge that picture where a man is nicely seated on an easy chair and reading something, what is said there is actually Richmond Silverio. It could be his name. We don't know, but that's what it says. You can, I hope you can read it from there, but that's what it says. One of the other interesting things I found was that many of these artists, were very reluctant to draw one aspect in the life of the Buddha, and that was what we commonly see in pictures today of the extreme self-mortification that he underwent during the last 6 years. If you look at the top picture, they have just totally ignored it. You see the ascetic Gautama, Siddhartha with Alara Kalama, Uddakaram Buddha and the 5 disciples. Nothing after that. In the second one, it says that he has spent this time and shows him seated, nothing more than that. And in the third one, you can see Siddhartha on the ground. And the story is that he one day felt unconscious on the ground, and one of the devas had gone and told Suddhodana that his son was dead. And he asked him, okay, did he die after attaining his goal or before that? And he said it was before that. And King Suddhodana said, no, that couldn't happen. That is then not my son. He cannot be dead. So they've drawn all that, but were reluctant to draw that extreme skeletal-like picture that we are familiar with today in the 20th century. In many instances, they would go to extreme ends to draw a story. And this is from the southern period, one of my favorite paintings. Now, in this tiny panel is the story of after Buddha Parinirvana, where the Malla kings were trying to light the pyre, but the pyre was not being lit. And when they found out why it was waiting until the Kashyapa came and worshipped. And the story says that when Kashyapa came, the feet of the Buddha's body opened up and was directed towards the Kashyapa so that he could worship him. And once he did that, he kept his head, worshipped the feet, and then once he did that, the pyre lit automatically. That is what is drawn. But if you look at this little part, you can see the details in that tiny panel where the feet have come down, the Kashyapa worshipping the Buddha and keeping his head and the forehead in doing so. And the best description I found of this particular incident comes from Maestro Kemadasa's Parinivan Mangalaya, the cantata, which says, Digakota Siripa Terindu Disavata, Muniduta Vende Nalala Tabahisa. And that is what the artist has drawn. Now, in these temples, the entrance generally had a Makaraj, and the tympanum there was illustrated with Maitri Bodhisattva if there was one entrance, and if there were two, generally there was the Mahabrahma. And they showed Maitri Bodhisattva, and Maitri Bodhisattva again was attended by women wearing the traditional dresses of that time. There was one difference in the Mirissa Samudragiri Viharaya where there were 3 entrances. The middle one had the Maitri Bodhisattva being attended by 2 women, traditional southern dress, and on either side there was King Dutugamunu and King Saddhatissa or Prince Saddhatissa. Both of them after death had gone to the Tautissa heaven and being attended by women who were wearing very period specific Western dresses. Now, why these three? Why are they on either side of the Maitri Bodhisattva? And the answer again is in the Mahavansa, because Mahavansa, the author, deified these two people and said, in the realm of Maitri Buddha, both Guttugamunu and Saddhatissa would be his two principal disciples. So who better than the principal disciples to be on either side of the Maitreya Bodhisattva? So that is what they had drawn there. In some places, with time, depending on who sponsored it, to show their allegiance to the crown, you see a crown on top, and inside that it would say when it was built and who built it. Little later, when they really wanted to show their allegiance to the queen, we see the queen coming in, and that's Victoria. We see the coat of arms, the lion and the unicorn, and Victoria drawn as the artist visualized Victoria. One interesting picture I found was from Karagampitiya, where there is no crown. It's not really Victoria either. It's a dark-skinned person with dark hair. Many books that I have read says it is trying to localize Victoria, but I beg to differ, because if you look at the legend, it says in Buddhist era 2339, which is 1795 in the Christian era, which is actually before the time of Victoria. So I don't know what they were trying to show and who this lady is. Now the kings are hardly seen, and this was one rare exception where I saw a king in the Sapugoda Sri Mahaviharya, not at the entrance to the main image house, but they had a side one where all the deities were. And at the entrance to that, under the Makaraj, was this male king. I don't know who it is, probably one of the Georges who came afterwards, but it didn't say who it is. That's even more interesting because there is a clear panel which normally would have the legend as to who this person is. And in certain ones, we find a mix of the Arabic numerals and the use of the Katapayana letters. Now, Katapayana is a type of a language that we used in our part of the world where numerals were depicted with letters. So I'm not sure exactly what it says, but I do know that Shaka Badam is Shaka Varsha. So Badam must be Varsha. I'm assuming that Sugata Badam is Buddha Varsha. So therefore it tells us when this was built. I'm not very sure though. It's something that I just started reading. So I'll probably know in a few months' time once I finish reading all those things. Right. So that's the southern period. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, there is what is known as the transitional period. Now, all the pictures that you saw up until now, the perspective was not really considered. They were very two-dimensional. You couldn't visualize where it was happening. There was no real background as such. Now, you see the 3D pictures coming into the picture. In the late 19th century, where you can see it as a 3D effect, still the same traditional Kandyan red background, but much more crowded and much more details in the pictures. It's interesting to see how they have evolved. If you look at the top two pictures of the Sulasmasthana, it just shows the Sripada. In the earlier periods, it was just the footprint. Later on, it shows people, particularly in the southern period, it shows people going to worship. And you can see the steps, so you know that it's a Sripada. But here, in the bottom one, it actually shows the Buddha keeping his left foot on the top of the Samantakuta, and that is what the legend says. And it's interesting to see the posture because you press down with the left foot, keeping your left hand on the knee so that you keep an imprint, and that is what the artist has drawn. Interesting picture here, which is the Buddha Parinirvana. I just took the picture simply because it says Kusinana Nuara in both Sinhala and English. Of course, a very crowded picture in comparison to the earlier ones, which shows the people with their emotions and so on. We finished our tour and went and met the head monk, and then he said, you know, this temple has a lot of cats in their pictures. Did you see the cats? So I said, no, we didn't see the cats. Where were the cats? He said, why at the Buddha Parinirvana picture there is a black cat. And the black cats are considered as bad omens. And that is why the artist has drawn the cat there. It's not exactly a black cat, but there is a cat with some black in it. Very fascinating. If you can see the corner here, you can see a cat right at the corner here. You can see a cat jumping out. And that's their interpretation. I don't know whether it is correct or not, but that's what was told to us. Okay, so you see the perspective coming in, and the images are drawn to show that, okay, there is a house, it's different, and it's not the two-dimensional picture that we were used to seeing up until that point. Then, of course, in Subodharamaya, in Karagampitiya, you can see the same style, much more elaborate now, like a watercolor picture with lots of different colors and in context and the perspective very clearly seen. It is interesting to see how they have drawn the movements of the animals. You can see the horse coming out, the side view, and jumping over the Anoma river. These styles were also seen outside the western province, and this is in Panduasnuwara Raja Mahaviharaya. Again, you see an image from the Vesantara Jataka. Incidentally, the Aliyatha, or is an albino elephant who is white, but for the artist, either he didn't know what it was, the elephant was black, what he has seen. It's not really the Aliyatha, although the legend says, Abamunanta Aliyathu Dandena Akare, and a black Aliyathu added to that. One interesting aspect that came into the pictures during this period is this Himalayan landscapes which are drawn in few temples. This is from Rankot Viharaya. Now, Himalayan landscape in the Buddhist literature is a place where all animals and human beings and others live very harmoniously together. So these are some of the, some of the details of that panel. That's one long panel, about 3 meters in one ambulatory passage. I've just taken a few just to illustrate the details of what was there. Sometimes they used incidents just to embellish the story, like the little boy who's milking the cow. The story is how Sujata was preparing her kiripidu, the milk rice, to be given to Siddhartha. And there they have drawn the cows being milked, which was not seen in the earlier period. In certain instances, they changed things. Now, we all know that if at all Mahamaya traveled, that would have been in a palanquin. And that is what the top cornermost picture is. So with time, it went into a carriage. Still, it was just Mahamaya with the baby. But later on, they suddenly got King Suddhodana to go and bring Mahamaya home, which is not there in Buddhist literature, not the ones that we know of anyway. And interestingly, the same was copied back into the Kandy region when they repainted some of their temples. And this is from the Hindagala Raja Mahaviharaya, which shows a typical southern school painting with King Suddhodana bringing Mahamaya home, the filler tree with various animals, and here you can see a bird with a nest with little chicklings. So again, the concepts traveled from the central hills to the southern parts, from the southern parts to the central hills. Now that was taking a little bit of change. In rare instances, they took something totally that was not in the literature and drew, like this. Now the legend says, Kudi gos Pabavatige isa ukunan bali. Now that is from the Kusa Jataka, and nowhere in the Kusa Jataka does it say that Pabavati had head lice. Now head lice were a menace. Anybody in my generation would know that head lice were a menace. None of us were spared. I was actually quite happy to see that Pabavati was also not spared. But interestingly, if you look at it, the way the artist has drawn, normally when somebody is cleaning your head for head lice, the person has to hold out the hand so that the head lice would be placed on the palm, and you would, kill it between your two thumbs. And if you can see here, you see Pabavati's hand, and there is a tiny head lice there. So that was something that was totally out of the story. He just drew it, and it just went very seamlessly with the rest of the story. It was just when I was reading around, and I suddenly read the legend, and I thought, okay, that's interesting, because that is not something that is commonly seen. So in rare instances, they would change the story, add things, just so that the story became more colorful. Moving on to modern times, Now these temples were different because just like in the southern period where we had a different generation of people who wanted to perpetuate Buddhism, by this time we had come to the 20th century and we were beginning to look for independence. And there was another breed of gentry who wanted to have temples, and now the epicenter has shifted to Colombo and its suburbs, and most of these drawings are seen in those places. One of the earliest I found was at Vajirarama in Bambalapitiya. This was very easy to date because there were plaques to identify when the buildings were made. So if you go by those plaques, this is probably early 1900s. Gone were those other crowded images. They selected few key images from the life of the Buddha, very simple lines, perspective is there, and you know what you are looking at. Jataka stories again lost their details and they were confined to single panels, again identifying key episodes so that you knew what the story was. My favorite is this. If you look at the earlier southern style of drawings, when you look at the Great Renunciation or the Mahabhinishkramana, it looks a very lifeless picture there. But look at Siddhartha here. If you look at his feet, he's half a mind whether to go or not. He's holding on to the bedpost, wondering whether he should leave his wife. And even his face does show that dilemma. One of the very few places where, in these instances, where the emotions can clearly be appreciated. Maligavage Sarlis was again one of the painters during this time who was heavily influenced by Western styles, the European styles. And if you look at this, if the legend was not there, it is like a scene from the Bible. The dresses that the people wear. This is what we would normally see in a biblical scene. But it says, Aurudu dahasakin lothura budu keneku lowa pahada wena bev devu rajaku pavasima. Now that's interesting because we don't really have prophecies in Buddhist literature. I'm not sure how he came about it. But if the legend was not there, this is pretty much like the Bible. More interestingly is how he treated the backgrounds. They were like watercolors, very gentle colors, each merging into each other. And when I went to look for something similar, this is what I found. The Rococo style in the 17th and 18th century in Europe. So he was influenced by the European styles and he brought it into his paintings. Of course, they were very theoretical. There was again, just like in the Vajirarama temple, selected episodes of the Jatakas, selected episodes from the life of the Buddha, and the backgrounds were very theoretical, like the Nurti that we would see, the tower hall type of things. As one of the monks said, it's like watching a Sivaji Ganeshan or M.G. Ramachandran movie. The backgrounds are like that. Out of all his drawings and the Isipatanaramaya, I found this most fascinating, not for how he has drawn the faces, but how he has drawn the dresses. It's very obvious that this is a flimsy material, this is a heavy one, and he has done that just by changing the colors and the lines to give that effect. He was widely copied, his style went to many directions. So Mulkirigala, far away when they did the newer paintings, they used his style. Again in Buduge Hinna in Galevela, the newer image house has his styles. Not only did they copy the format that he did, they also copied the styles, the painting, the watercolor type of paintings that he used for the background. Incidentally, he is the only artist after those periods who was extensively copied. Now earlier, up until that point, we saw schools where all the artists were using the same style. Now here we see the end of it. Sarlis was copied very widely, but none of the artists who came after that were copied. One of the artists who copied Sarlis was Valigam Oliveira, and he was one of the few who actually drew this extreme self-mortification in a temple painting, which is not very commonly seen. His more better known ones are actually the older images in the Bellangville image house. Very few are remaining now because we have Somabandhu Vidyapati's paintings painted over those, but this is one of his. Next artist in this period is Solis Mendis. These are from his earlier paintings. He is known for his Colonial image house paintings, but these are from an earlier period. where he drew in the peripheral regions until he was brought to limelight to draw the Colonial ones. There again we see his usual lines coming into the picture, and there are selected Jataka stories with few incidents. This heavy drapery, probably a remnant of Salis, and one instant where I saw something which probably resonated with the nationalistic feelings that were coming out at that time. The Madhuma Bandara episode, not something that is commonly seen in temple paintings. Of course, he is better known for his paintings in Colonial. There he had used again the key episodes from the life of the Buddha, not a single Jataka story in the new image house, but incidents from Mahavansa drawn to the letter, and also incidents that were from the Colonial region. So the history of Colonial is what he drew in the newer image house. His masterpieces were a lesson in attention to detail. There again you see how the Mahavansa is depicted, the deity holding the Rajayatana tree when the Buddha came to Nagadeva. Much more elaborate, of course, than the previous one, but it's the same story. And of course, in the late 1930s and early 1940s was George Keat, whose style was totally different. He was educated and had a wide exposure. He used the Gautami Viharaya to draw, basically, identified few instances from the life of the Buddha, and he drew murals there. His style, of course, is totally different. Obviously, it's not reproduced anywhere else. I found his expressions in most of the faces the same, irrespective of the event. This was one exception where every single face actually shows the moment. Tired, disgusted, not interested, and the expressions are exactly what it was. But here again, my favorite is this little one here. How Yashodhara is holding on to Rahula to show him his father. The protective gesture. This is a boy who's seeing his father for the first time in his life. The mother is concerned. She's holding on to him and saying, that is your father. That protective gesture is, for me, out of all the pictures I have seen at Gautami Viharaya, the best part. And ladies and gentlemen, in 1948, we got what we ceded. We ceased to be a colony of the British Empire. So, hopefully within the time given to me, I have taken you through my journey of over a decade. I tried to share with you what I found as to why they painted. They wanted to give certain messages, different ones at different times. What did they paint and why they selected those? The styles they followed and what were they trying to tell and why. It is these art, the paintings are a visual display of Buddhist literature and the Mahavansa, not necessarily the Dhamma. And that's an interesting distinction that I came to understand. It was an effective way of spreading the teachings of the Buddha, a very graphic display, much better than a sermon or going to the temple and learning. It was a living art that was continually evolving and adapting. None of these places that I showed you are archaeological monuments. These are the village temples. For me, it was a place to get a picture. But for the people who were there, it was their temple, the place they go to worship, the place they go to meditate, the place they go to find some solace. It is a living art. It is an art that grows with people. So these are my references, some of my references, the main ones that is. I'm deeply indebted to all these monks, there are only few here, and the lay custodians of these places who gave me free access to photograph and explore as much as I wanted, shared their knowledge with a cup of tea or a bite whenever that was available. It was very refreshing to get that hospitality. I'm deeply indebted to them. The story of the Mahakashyapa Thero and the Buddha Parinirvana, I actually learned from this elderly gentleman who was looking after the Mulgirigala, the temple complex. And he gave us the story. And when I heard the story, when I saw it next, I looked to see whether it was there. So there's a wealth of knowledge that is hidden in these papers, which cannot be found from any textbook. I'd like to acknowledge with immense gratitude Professor Sudarshan Senaviratne, not only for introducing me to the National Trust, but years ago when I first did this lecture in a public forum, he came and spoke to me after the lecture and said it was good, but he went one step beyond and reached out to me through an email and said you should continue. And I've been in touch with him since then, which is why I'm here tonight. I hope I have been able to do justice for his introduction and for getting me here. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for both you and those who joined virtually.
Thank you, Professor. So I heard that temple art is dying out now. I heard that temple art is dying out. The painters are considerably fewer than they used to be in the past. Is it true? And are you actually allowed to restore some of these paintings? Or are they conserved for archaeological purposes? I heard the amount of temple artists, the people who actually paint, is considerably lower now than it used to be.
All right, yeah, not sure of the numbers as such, whether they are lower or not, but I think the need is probably less because the purpose has been fulfilled. So as I said, during that period, there were messages that they needed to give to the people. The level of education was probably lower than what it is today, and one of the easiest ways in giving a message was to give a graphic display of what you wanted to say. So when you looked at what they drew, they were very graphic and they exactly told the people what they had to know. So whether they are less now or not, I honestly don't know. But in the 20th century, there are a lesser number of paintings to be seen compared to, of course, the earlier period. To answer your second question, all of these are archaeological monuments, but these are also the village temples. So they are open, you can go and then explore them as much as you want. The monks are generally very cooperative.
Thank you. Just to ask, are you allowed to restore the damaged paintings, or are they preserved for archaeological reasons?
Okay, there is restoration work being done, which is done in conjunction with the Department of Archaeology and the experts. Now the Vajraramya paintings that I showed were actually restored just about 2 years back. So there was a different set of paintings earlier over it of a later period, and when they noticed that the paint was peeling and they wanted to do it again, they realized that there was something much more underneath. So that was entirely restored. There are various groups doing, the university students and the archaeology people. There is restoration being done. The Samudragiri Vihare, when I first went, the temples, the paintings were in a very bad state, but when I went about 2 years back, that had been restored as well. So that is done by experts. So because these are archaeological monuments, the villagers or the monks in the temples are not allowed to do anything.
Thank you, Professor.
In background is red color. Is there any reason that it would have been used?
That was the color that was there in the Kandyan region and that spread. I presume it's because it shows out very clearly, because most of the pictures were drawn in a very light color. The dark colors came much later, so the contrast was there and the figures would be seen very clearly, and it was much more easier to see them separate rather than together. So probably that's why, but I'm sure the experts are here in the audience and they might be able to give you a better answer.
I'm not quite sure the exact answer, but Kumaraswamy has, Ananda Kumaraswamy in his medieval Sinhalese art has a whole wonderful chapter on painting. He gives all the ingredients. He was capable of doing it because he got a DSc and a PhD in double quick time and chemically analyzed, you know, the paintings. And he was one of the first to, you know, repeat that this horrible situation that was taking place during his lifetime, that there were industrial paints being used all over in Kandy, and that prompted him to write a letter to the Kandyan chiefs, you know, imploring for them to safeguard their temples and their murals. He says that basically there were some 5 colors which was easy to manufacture because they were from natural materials and from gums and raisins, from trees and from berries. So I just went through this morning, but I can't remember, but there's quite a lot he has said about why red was an important ingredient, important color. One of the most difficult colors was blue, which they couldn't replicate, and they found it very difficult to do. That's the only answer I have to this problem. Yes, back to you.
I think
The natural ones, yeah.
red color came after Gampola period, or from Gampola period, because cinema was not used by Sri Lankan painters. It was introduced during Gampola period and also influenced the South Indian painting. So it's red. Earlier we didn't have any sort of that kind of background. This is red, and they also use in buildings or whatever it is. Red was the background right throughout with cinema. That's Mercurio.
Fairly extensively. If you look at I've selected only a few, but then if you look at the entire story, that was based on what they saw. So the lifestyles were very widely shown, and the details will show you how the people were living, just like the kitchen that I showed you. The shops that were there and all that were a reflection of the times. So they used it pretty widely probably because it was easier for the people to relate to them. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. I think that was a fascinating presentation, particularly because you had looked at it in a chronology, you know, rather than looking at it as an isolated paintings. And looking at Ananda Kumaraswamy's work, where he talks of the Kandyan artist, the strict rules within which a Kandyan artist was trained, going over and over the Tiringatale, till it's perfected and so on. You seem to suggest, and I think perhaps that's correct, that when he came to the southern period, the artist was suddenly released from that, and was allowed to introduce a lot of other things, freer to do what he or she, I don't know whether females painted, but so I think that transition is something very important that you brought up, and we need to document it in some form and keep it.
Restoration, all this restoration done with chemical the paints rather than the paramparika stuff.
Okay, I had a chat with some of them and they said they try to get the original one as much as possible using the natural pigments that the artists use. Because when we went to, I think, to Shaila Bimbarame again in Dodandua, they were doing some restorations and that's what they told. So they wouldn't probably go away from chemical paints as much as possible. Not sure.
Chandanie, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have been to temple in Cambodia and I have seen the pictures. Just like you show, and with the script underneath. And if you just cover the script, it's like as if you are in a temple in Sri Lanka. What is your experience with that?
Yeah, okay, so when you look at the region, we have a lot of, lot of interactions with each other and the other countries. So what I showed you from Thailand has the same style. So it's probably that they were traveling and the techniques traveled and ideas traveled and they used the same thing. Now particularly the South Indian one that I showed, it was just like looking at a Kandyan drawing but of a different story where they would use the Indian stories for their illustrations. So probably it's because they traveled and the ideas traveled with them. And that we see in Sri Lankan art when you look at from the times of Anuradhapura up until now, we see how much we have used from others and made it ours. So that each country will have its own unique thing, but with the input of various others who come to the country and stay there.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for the nice presentation. Regarding Ganinanses in murals, the paintings in what Thammarama in Ayutthaya also has a couple of Ganinanses in that picture where Venerable Upali is preaching, I think.
Yes,
it is one in one of those three pictures that
yes.
it's there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because I think they would have been in the deputation that way went because they were all like not necessarily Ganinanses, but they were not those who had undergone higher ordination. So they were all, even the Saranankara Thero at that point, at the initial period was known as Saranankara Unnanse.
Yeah.
So the Unnanse, the term was generally left for those people who had not reached that higher ordination state. So maybe some of them also went in that deputation. Because there is literature which shows that the kings actually did give a lot to the Ganinanses during that period for various favors that they did for the kings. And they supported their temples as well.
Yeah, and I think after the Upasampada, some monks went back to Ayutthaya, and I think one of the local monks also went called Nontaburi Ganinanse. He lived in just north of Bangkok. I think the message would have gone as to how it should be drawn actually. So that's what made me.
Yeah, I've never actually seen the Ganinanse as being drawn anywhere except at that temple.
Yeah, it's there in Thammarama, yes.
Okay, in Sri Lanka I have never seen
Sri Lanka,
except
yes,
that Vattegama Purana Vihara in Mailla.
Yes, that's correct perhaps. Thank you.
Degaldoru, I mean, without the lights, most of the temples, the murals are very dark, and I wonder how people appreciated these murals. I mean, when they were even Degaldoru, now you have to light up the place to see the mural. So, what did you do?
Light it up. I never use artificial light, and I use the natural light that is there. What I do is I push up the ISO and then change the aperture size and so on. It's handheld, the pictures. That is why some of the quality is not all that good. But the available light is reasonably all right to get pictures with that sort of a camera now. So you can manage. Looking at it, physically, of course, it becomes a problem, and their lighting is not the best because you suddenly get this light bulb hanging in the middle and very bright. It's totally disruptive and very difficult to look at it. Yeah, before electricity, I'm sure they would have had their ways of lighting it to draw, but now it's a bit of a problem when you go there to see.
I think probably the secret lies amongst early photographers. You know, what they did at Dambula was, and some of the temples, they got 8 young boys to hold mirrors, and the mural was reflected. I used to wonder how H.W. Cave and those other 19th century photographers, before the advent of electricity, how did they get exquisite photographs of the temples. And this was a method which was shown by one of the photographers, saying that they held successive mirrors and then deflected the mural onto the photographer's plate, you know. And that was the only, even when Kumaraswamy was working in Degaldarua, there was absolutely no electricity in those areas, and he's taken some excellent photographs, you know. The other comment I would like to make is something which you probably know about. The Bengali school obviously had a lot of influence by the 19th century in Sri Lanka, and people like Solius Mendis were also trained by Henricus, this fantastically excellent burgher artist. I wrote an article about it in the newspaper some time ago, but he was asked by, I think, D.R. Vijayavardhana, or, you know, when they were doing Colonial Temple, to come and assist, and Solius Mendis, and I think he learned a lot from Henricus. And I think one of the, probably also, Christianity also seeped in through his, because he did a lot of the church murals. Sorry? Sarli, yeah, yes. Earlier version, yeah, I'm sorry, that's true. Any more questions? Anyway, thank you very much for a very nice lecture. And on behalf of the National Trust, may I present you with one of their... Can you come and join us so that we can have some... Okay? Please join us for some refreshment.